Social media has become a part of our everyday lives, whether it's being used for fun or educational purposes. As technology and social media has grown, it has changed and affected the way we live our lives drastically. What this short documentary will discuss is how it has affected students across education and discuss the pros and cons of social media within the education system. I'm here today with Frances Swinburne, Senior Manager Pupil Support, Primary Teacher and Mother of Three, who has kindly agreed to answer some questions. Tell us about yourself and your work.
I'm Frances and I have been a teacher for 35 years. I retired at Christmas, bringing it all to a dramatic end. I taught in the mainstream primary school for a few years. I then taught in SEBN, so schools for pupils with social, emotional and behavioural needs, for over 15 years. And I set up and managed the service for South Lanarkshire Council for primary age pupils. I then moved on to become Senior Manager Pupil Support, and that job entailed working with the primaries, nurseries and secondary schools in Cambuslang and Rutherglen area. And the main focus of the job was to ensure that any child with an identified additional support need got the support that they needed to enable them to stay in mainstream school.
What are the pros of social media in education? How has this benefited teachers and students alike?
So the positives around social media within education means that it's relevant and it's engaging. Education can sometimes be quite dry for a lot of kids, and the use of technology has certainly improved engagement and learning. Alongside the introduction of social media within the classrooms and the use of blogs and Twitter and Facebook pages, ICT in general, where Chromebooks are commonplace, iPads are just part of the general curriculum. We use software, assistive technology software, to ensure that children with specific learning difficulties, for example dyslexia, can engage with the full curriculum and can achieve their full potential. I think it's easy for staff to use because staff are quite familiar with IT, they're completely au fait with it all. Our schools are all new, they're all modern, they've all got touch screens. And we noticed that when the wee ones come into primary one, the first thing they do is start swiping the screen, but it doesn't quite work like that. So it just shows you how used to using the Apple technology they are. One of the biggest advantages is that if you've got schools that are doing similar topics, for example, one of our schools was doing World War II, and through Glow, which is the email network for education staff, somebody in Shetland was doing the same topic and had a soldier coming in to talk to the kids, and this school was able to be part of that whole discussion too. They were able to join in and interview and ask their questions of the soldier as part of that whole process. So it made learning much more real and much more pertinent for the children.
Now, what are the cons to social media in education? How has it made it difficult for teachers and students?
Some of the difficulties around it link to the fact that pupils abuse it. They use their phones in the class all the time. You can't get their telephones off them. They need to be in contact with their pals like every single minute of every single day, and it causes a lot of issues in some classes around behaviour management, and it interrupts the learning of others. It needs to have a council-wide policy. There needs to be a policy in place that is signed by the delegated manager for ICT within every establishment, so that there's clear consistency in the expectations of the behaviour of the person who's in charge of ICT in schools. The other downside you have is that obviously if you're putting something on Twitter, for example, parents can comment on it, and most of the time that's positive, but some of the time it can be quite negative as well, which can be very difficult for schools to manage because you've got a professional duty and you can't just go on and argue back. So you have to very carefully manage all of that. So that's a real challenge for schools. And the negative side of it is definitely around the use of the mobile phones all the time by certain children and schools.
What are the changes in the learning system since this?
I think one of the biggest changes we had was obviously the response that we had to make in the light of the COVID epidemic. We very quickly closed schools, and lots of photocopying was done at that particular point, and packs were made for children to take home. but that was just not sustainable. There's no way that could continue. So we had to look at the IT that we had available, and we used platforms such as Teams, Google Classroom, Zoom, depending on which authority you worked in. It depended what platform they used, and we used them to deliver learning directly to our children. Some of it was done live. There was live teaching done, and again there had to be really strict legislation around that, and there was council policies written around the safety of the children and the staff when delivering live lessons, because there could be potential vulnerabilities raised there. So we looked at all of that, wrote all the policies and got all that set up, and teachers delivered a combination of live lessons and recorded lessons. Some of it could be as simple as like early years teachers reading stories. They recorded themselves reading a story, and the wee ones could all sit and listen to it, right down to resources being produced and lessons being recorded for Nat 5 and higher English. So it was a real challenge, but it was one of the most significant changes, and it's a change that had some positives and it had quite a few negatives as well. There was a lot of children really missed the contact that they had with their teacher and obviously their peers as a result of that.
So as a learner myself at college at the time, I did find it difficult having to kind of separate from everything, and especially losing the kind of social aspect of it. It was quite hard to kind of jump between everything.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly an experience that is shared by most learners at that time, unfortunately.
How have the methods of communication changed, and what are the benefits and difficulties that's come with the change?
So the main change that we've had is obviously the move onto the kind of an IT-based learning platform. They're now routinely used across schools. If you think about things like supported study, they're all being done online now. All those classes are all run online. They're centrally organised by the council, and pupils from any school can go and join whichever class they feel they want to at whatever time. So where you had previously maybe two subjects running on the same day, for example, if you had English and chemistry running on the same day at the same time, and you had students studying both, they had to choose, and they effectively missed time in one or the other. Now that doesn't happen because they can access the authority-wide ones, so that's been really positive around it. One of the big shifts that we had was around transitions. Transitions are really, really important, whether it's early years into primary 1 or primary into secondary. And normally parents and children would be up at the schools, they'd be visiting. So schools had to think then really creatively about, right, what do we do? Because we still need these kids to know what school looks like. But school looked very different for everybody coming back in after COVID. So they used lots of like Twitters and blogs and podcasts and things to kind of introduce themselves to the pupils. And they did virtual school tours and posted them online so that everybody could see them and they were familiar with each kind of department. Obviously, kind of the disadvantage of that is the time that's involved. There was a massive amount of time involved. Firstly, in creating lessons and resources that could be produced online. Marking had to be done. Teachers became available to their students and to their parents more or less 24 hours a day, because they were answering emails at all hours of the day and night. So the kind of the boundaries of the school day disappeared a bit. So the workload was a huge difficulty. For lots of kids though, online learning worked really well. So for example, some of the kids that have ASD, they really benefited from not having to go to school and cope with that environment, the massive environment, moving around the school, discussing things with all different teachers, etc. So their anxiety decreased and their engagement in learning increased. However, for a lot of kids, it was the opposite. They just couldn't cope with not being in school. They couldn't cope with not seeing their pals. They didn't like the online learning at all. For some kids, they didn't have access to online learning, so there was a huge job had to be done by the council that I worked for, and Chromebooks were being delivered to homes where there was no technology, and we had MiFis so that they could access the internet as well. They were all getting delivered. So that was a real kind of a challenge for us. And I suppose it's a bit like there are positives and there are negatives for everything. And we've retained a lot of the kind of the positives. Time used to be spent going in my job from school to school, from meeting to meeting. A lot of time was taken up travelling, trying to find a parking space. There was a lot of stress around that. When I was doing Teams meetings, I could go from one meeting to the next meeting to the next meeting to the next meeting because I was doing it in the house. So you could cram in, maybe 6-7 meetings a day, whereas before you maybe only got 3 in. So there are real positives around that, but the biggest, I suppose, loss was the relationships, the distance that you had between you, because some people found it very difficult to speak and to be part of the conversation. So if I was having a meeting with a family about their child, some parents were much less confident in giving their opinions because they were doing it on a screen, usually on their phone. They would be much more able to do that when they were sitting face to face. So it was good to be able, towards the end of my career, to move back to having parental meetings face to face, usually in a gym hall, with everybody spread out, but at least you were face to face, and that did make a huge, huge difference to it. But I would say that there are real aspects that we absolutely should retain, and we do really need to look, I think, again at how children best learn, because I do think there's clear evidence out there that for a lot of kids, coming to school was just too hard. And they've got a better chance to achieve their potential in a different kind of way.
And as a mother, how have you seen the changes and how have they affected the way your children have learned?
So there's a 10-year age gap between my oldest and my youngest. So there's been a massive change in education in that short space of time that they were all at school. When the eldest one started school, it was very traditional. It was pencil, paper, and sit in your seat, and it wasn't very active. By the time the youngest one was going to school, it was much more active learning. So there was a lot of movement around different stations. Still some sitting on the bottom and doing pencil and paper stuff, but definitely primary had changed quite dramatically. Even nursery had changed. I took my daughter out of nursery because I didn't like the fact that there was formal learning going on there. I didn't think it was appropriate for a 3-year-old to be given worksheets home to do as homework. For me, nursery is about play. And by the time our youngest was going to nursery, it was a very different experience. It was very much a play-based learning. With regards to ICT and their learning, I would say that our eldest had very little ICT in his, as part of his formal education. His was very much a traditional, probably very similar education experience to the one that I had 30 years before. The youngest one, by the time he left, was in a brand new school where it was kitted out with all sorts of ICT that they just take for granted, so Chromebooks and iPads and notebooks and netbooks and laptops and everything were just commonplace. And I think they had a much more rich experience because of it, because they were able to learn to use the ICT that was available very safely. They learned rules, what was appropriate and what wasn't appropriate, and well, like everybody, they probably broke some of those rules some of the time. But there's always consequences, and they had to learn that too. So, but one of the biggest things that I do remember is when mobile phones became very much the kind of the norm, and our middle child had a mobile phone when she started secondary school, and she started sending text messages that were all abbreviations, and basically she was told that it was getting taken off her if she didn't stop doing that, because it was going to ruin her chances of actually, 1, being able to spell, and 2, getting a higher English. So it got taken from her. But the changes have been absolutely incredible over the lifespan of the 3 children that we have. I mean, they're all adults now, but from 1996 until 2014, roughly, their experiences were very, very different. And ICT is just very much now part and parcel of everything that they do and everything that they use.
Thank you so much for doing this interview. It's greatly appreciated. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just that I think it's really important. Say no, then add. Just that I do think ICT has got a place. I do think that social media is something that can be used advantageously. I think people need educated about the difficulties that they can face and how to not get themselves into it. And I know there's terrific work going on around that, but I do think that probably parents need a bit more education in how to limit the amount of screen time that their children have, because I do think that you can start to see it impacting now on the speech and language development of our younger children. They're coming into nursery non-verbal, they're coming into primary 1 and they're still non-verbal, and it's because they've got far too much screen time and nobody's interacting with them, and that is very sad and very dangerous and opens up a whole can of worms for the future. So whilst it's good, we need to be mindful of the difficulties that it can bring.